According to news accounts, there are 32 or 34 so-called czars in the Obama White House and government. Respected voices in the Senate, Senator Byrd, Senator Hutchison, the senior Democrat, a senior Republican, have pointed out that these czars are an affront to the Constitution. They're antidemocratic. They are a poor example of a new era of transparency, which is what was promised to this country. I would add they are a poor way to manage the government, and they seem to me to be the principal symptom of this administration's 8-month record of too many Washington takeovers. We have an AIDS czar, an auto recovery czar, a border czar, and a California water czar. We have a car czar and a central region czar and a domestic violence czar. There is an economic czar, an energy and environment czar, a faith-based czar, and a Great Lakes czar. The list goes on up to 32 or 34. One of these, for example, is the pay czar, Mr. Kenneth Feinberg, the Treasury Special Master for Compensation. He will approve pay packages at 7 firms receiving TARP funds, thus deciding how much is too much. This will affect the top earners at some of the major corporations in America. According to Mr. Feinberg, in answer to some questions, he said, quote, "The statute provides guideposts, but the statute ultimately says I have discretion to decide what it is that these people should make, and that my determination will be final. Anything is possible under the law." That is the pay czar. Then we have a manufacturing czar. The manufacturing czar's name is Mr. Ron Bloom. He is also the car czar. Now, we've had manufacturing czars before in other administrations, but as roll call pointed out on September 8th, Mr. Bloom's background and new position differs from the 2 czars who served under former President George W. Bush. Bloom is a former union official, remains close to leaders in the organized labor. Bush's manufacturing czars were placed in the Commerce Department. Bloom, on the other hand, was entrusted with a high-profile presidential task force on autos and will operate within an office that has broad authority over domestic policy. He will head the auto task force, which is in the Treasury Department. Or according to the policy director for the AFL-CIO, Mr. Bloom is expected to have a major role in the development of climate change legislation. So-called Buy American provisions that favored homegrown products and tax credit for domestic industry need to be included, said the policy director for the AFL-CIO, in the climate change provision. If it's not done right, the president could lose votes, says the AFL-CIO policy director. In other words, Mr. Bloom may end up being the protectionist czar as well. Then there is the health czar, a very distinguished Tennessean, Nancy Ann DeParle, a very, very able person whom I know well. But who's in charge of health care policy? Is it the Secretary of Health and Human Services, confirmed by the Senate, accountable to the Congress, accountable therefore to the people of the country, or someone in the White House who an administration official says, quote, will wake up every morning focused on health care reform. She's going to be focused on that the entire day through, unquote. There have always been czars in the White House, at least since President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Of the 32 or 34 that we have today, and I'm using those 2 numbers because they're different reports, and 2 or 3 are vacant, only 8 are confirmed by the Senate. We've had them before, but there has never been anything quite like this. Let me take my concerns one by one. Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States gives to the Congress the appropriations power and sets up in Articles 2 and 3, the judicial and the executive branches, a system of checks and balances to make sure that no one branch of the federal government runs away with the government. Senator Robert Byrd, the President pro tem of the Senate, wrote a letter to President Obama on February 23rd. Senator Byrd, who is often called the constitutional conscience of the Senate, expressed his concern over the increasing appointments of White House czars and the relationship between these new positions and their executive branch counterparts, noting, quote, "Too often I've seen these lines of authority and responsibility become tangled and blurred, sometimes purposely, to shield information and to obscure the decision-making process." That's Senator Byrd speaking. He goes on to say, "The rapid and easy accumulation of power by White House staff can threaten the constitutional system of checks and balances. At the worst, White House staff have taken direction and control of programmatic areas that are the statutory responsibility of Senate-confirmed officials." Continuing, as presidential assistants and advisors, says Senator Byrd, "These White House staffers are not accountable for their actions to the Congress, to cabinet officials, and to virtually anyone but the president. They rarely testify before constitutional committees and often shield the information and decision-making process behind the assertion of executive privilege. In too many instances, White House staff have been allowed to inhibit openness and transparency and reduce accountability." More recently, one of the senior Republicans, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas, who's the senior Republican on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Transportation, and Science, says in an op-ed in the Washington Post, quote, "I oversee legislation and agencies that cover policy areas as vast and varied as trade, technology, transit, consumer protection, and commercial regulation. As many as 10 of the 32 czars functionally fall under my committee's jurisdiction. Yet neither I nor the committee chairman have clear authority to compel these czars to appear before our panel and report what they're doing. The Obama administration presented only 2 of these officials for our consideration before they assumed their duties. We have had no opportunity to probe the others' credentials," unquote. That's Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to put in the record, following my remarks, the comments of Senator Robert Byrd and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas.
Without objection.
As the senator said, there's been no vetting by the Congress, no confirmation by the senators, no appropriation requests to be considered by us, no testimony, no hard questions. Who's making the policy then on health care, on climate change, on energy? I have been reading President James K. Polk's diaries. I may be the only one in the United States reading them these days. They're actually very interesting. He wrote down every night what he did that day back in the 1840s. And among the things he did was he had a cabinet meeting every Tuesday and every Saturday, and every major issue that came before him, whether it was the war with Mexico, the annexation of Texas, the taking over of the argument with Great Britain about what to do in Oregon, he submitted all those questions to his cabinet, and then the cabinet, of course, had to go before the Congress and testify. He didn't always disagree with the cabinet. Secretary of State Buchanan disagreed with him quite a bit. But Secretary Buchanan then had to go before the Congress and come back and tell the president what he heard. That was a long time ago, Mr. President, but the framers had in mind a checks and balances where the president leads the country, the cabinet manages the government, and the cabinet, the managers of the government, are accountable to the people through their elected representatives. The 32 or 34 czars is not the way the American system government is supposed to work. It is not an era of transparency. It is so much centralization that it is the antithesis of freedom, which is the principal characteristic, the principal aspect of the American character. The second aspect of this large number of czars that is troublesome is the issue of managing the government. 40 years ago, I worked in the White House for President Nixon under a wise man named Bryce Harlow. I ask unanimous consent to proceed as if in morning business until I'm finished with my remarks. Thank you. Mr. Harlow had worked for President Eisenhower. He was a wise counselor to President Johnson. He knew a lot about how the American government is supposed to work. And he said to me, then a very young staff member, he said, Lamar, our job here in the White House is to push the merely important issues out of the White House so that we can reserve to the president only that handful of truly presidential issues. To push the merely important out of the White House, reserving to the president the handful of truly presidential issues. George Reedy, who was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, wrote that the job of the president is three things: to see an urgent need, to develop a strategy for meeting the need, and persuading half the people he's right. Mr. Reedy didn't say anything about managing the government of the United States out of the White House. He talked about leading the country. Our current president is very skilled at persuading half the people he's right. He's demonstrated that in an election. He continues to demonstrate that with his speeches. That's not the issue here. The issue here is whether he ought to bring into the White House or closer to him into the government a large group of men and women who are accountable to him but not accountable to anybody else. It's not good for the President of the United States, I would submit, to have close to him people that he listens to who don't have to listen to anybody else, or at least who don't have to listen to the elected representatives of government. Everyone knows that the first thing that happens when a new president is elected is people start picking offices. And which offices do they pick? They want the office closest to the president, because it's an unwritten rule in Washington, D.C. that your influence in Washington is measured in direct proportion by the number of inches you are physically from the President of the United States. So the First Lady usually ends up with the most influence, and after that, you go right down the hall in the West Wing over to the Executive Office Building, and after a while, you get out around the cabinet offices. I used to be one of those in the first President Bush's administration, and it is true that the persons with the most influence with the president are almost always the men and women who are closest to him. And the other aspect of management that this seems to contravene in the White House is the one thing at a time idea. One thing at a time is best exemplified, I would suggest, by President Eisenhower when he said, "I shall go to Korea." He said that more than a half century ago when the big issue before the country, there were many, but the biggest one was the Korean War. And he said in October of election year, "I shall go to Korea." And in November he went. And he said to the American people, "I will focus my attention on the war in Korea. It will have my full attention until the matter is concluded." And because he was president and because he had capacity for leadership, people believed that he'd probably get that one thing done. And in fact, he did. Because in our system of government, people know that if the president selects a single issue, say it's health care, say it's climate change, say it's resolving the debt, fixing Social Security, picks one thing and throws himself into that for as long as he's there with everything he's got, the odds are he's going to wear everybody else out. Now, he might have to compromise a little bit along the way. I used to think as governor, and the presiding officer was once a governor in Virginia, and often our best proposals would get changed in the legislature. And I learned a long time ago you could either condemn that or say, well, they improved my proposal, give the other side some credit, and go on to the next issue. But a governor, and certainly a president, who picks one thing can get a lot done. We have a lot of very talented people in and around the president. The president himself is highly intelligent as well-liked by the American people, as well as he is by those of us in the Senate. But sometimes I'm afraid the Obama White House resembles the Harvard Law Review meeting, where everybody has a bright idea, everybody's very smart, but everyone forgets it. Someone has to be the operator. Someone has to make it run. Someone has to pick one thing and lean into it for as long as it goes. So my point is that having a large number of bright advisors, czars, for every issue under the sun, clustered around the president, coming up with bright ideas, unaccountable to the Congress for most of what they have to say, is not the best way for a president to pick a single major issue, let's say health care, and lead the country. And finally, Mr. President, the number of czars that we now have today that have accumulated over the last several administrations and today have reached a record level is anti-democratic. Czars are usually Russians. They're not Americans. Czars are usually imperialists, not Democrats. The dictionary says that a czar is a, quote, autocratic ruler or leader, or, quote, an emperor or king, not associated with a democracy, not associated with an era of transparency. Czars are really alien to our way of thinking, our way of government. I'm afraid, Mr. President, that czars are becoming a symbol of this administration. The number of Washington takeovers, and let me not just use my own words on this. A New York Times article yesterday said 1 year after the collapse of Lehman Brothers set off a series of federal interventions, the government is the nation's biggest lender, insurer, automaker, and guarantor against risk for investors large and small. Between financial rescue missions and the economic stimulus program, government spending accounts for a bigger share of the nation's economy, 26%, than at any time since World War II. The government is financing 9 out of 10 new mortgages in the United States. If you buy a car from General Motors, you're buying from a company that's 60% owned by the government. If you take out a car loan or run up your credit card, the chances are good the government is financing both your debt and that of your bank. And if you buy life insurance from the American International Group, you'll be buying from a company that's almost 80% federal owned. I ask unanimous consent to include this article from the New York Times on September 14 in the record following my remarks.
Without objection.
Czars are becoming a symbol of a runaway government in Washington with too many Washington takeovers. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the British moralist, a few centuries ago, was once introduced to a talking dog in a London pub. And the proud owner of the dog asked Dr. Johnson, what did he think of how well his dog talked? And Dr. Johnson is reported to have said he was not so impressed with how well the dog talked, but that the dog talked at all. And that's about the way I feel about White House czars and government czars, nearly 3 dozen of them. I'm not so worried about who they are, Mr. President. I'm worried that the czars are there at all. And I believe that the American people, in addition to respected senators such as Senator Byrd on that side of the aisle and Senator Hutchison on this side of the aisle, we sense that this is a problem. So my respectful suggestion to the President is along the same lines that Senator Byrd and Senator Hutchison have made. I believe it is time to push these czars out of the White House. Leave the management of government to the managers of government in the cabinet and the positions in the departments of government who are accountable to the Congress, accountable for their confirmation, accountable for the questions of members of Congress, accountable for the appropriations that have to be approved by Congress before they can spend the people's money. That is the American way. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.